I think the biggest issue that's not being discussed in our society is fear. And why people fear, live in fear, and why people like the president can generate so much support for destructive behavior both here and abroad. I think that the people are not really talking about that. The other topic that is not discussed, which is very much related, is love. We deal with the love of power and do not understand the power of love.
Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up.
Melvin H. King was born in Boston's South End in 1928. He is a husband and a father of 6 children, a politician, a political activist and organizer, and the kind of leader that we need more of. This is a glimpse of his life and his thoughts. After graduating from Boston Technical High School in 1946 and then from Claflin College in 1950, he received his master's degree in education and began teaching math, first at Boston Trade High School and then at his alma mater, Boston Technical High School. In 1953, King left the classroom to work with at-risk youth managing a settlement house in Boston's South End. He later became youth director at the United South End Settlements, focusing on street gangs. His belief in neighborhood control regarding urban renewal policy and federal funds to assist poor people in his community clashed with his employer, and he was fired. After huge protests, he was rehired as a community organizer and founded CAUSE, Community Assembly for United South End. In 1967, he became director of the New Urban League of Greater Boston. After a decade and a half, this was only the beginning of a lifelong dedication to people and to his ideals. During the early morning of April 26, 1968, Mel King led a group of activists to occupy land in the South End where homes had recently been demolished to create a parking lot. Reacting to the City of Boston's policy of demolition without relocation, as had happened in Boston's West End a decade earlier, activists erected a sleep-in protest demonstration with tents and wooden shanties demanding affordable housing. Celtics legend Bill Russell, who owned a South End restaurant, provided food for the protesters. The event was peaceful and festive, and the story received extensive coverage in the local media. 20 years later, in 1988, the massive 10-city complex was completed with 269 mixed-income affordable apartments, retail space, and an award-winning design. This project takes up a full city block and serves as an attractive and important complement to the Boston neighborhoods and businesses it serves.
I could look across the street at 10 City, the development, and in 1968 there was a demonstration to make sure that we could get the city to turn the land over for mixed income housing. It also became a model because we were able to, out of this struggle, develop an elected urban renewal committee. And almost all of the housing that supports people whose incomes are low and moderate, and allows them to remain in this neighborhood today, given its changes, are a result of the people's elected Urban Renewal Committee, and then their being able to organize and take over the South End Urban Renewal Committee.
After running for the Boston School Committee 3 times in the 1960s, Mel was elected as a Massachusetts State Representative from the South End in 1973 and served until 1982.
Even before he ran for mayor, Mel made history as a state representative, getting elected from the South End. And you know, he was a leading progressive and a strong black voice in the House of Representatives. They hadn't really had one before. I heard a story once, I don't know for a fact that this is true, although I believe it is, that they changed the rules of the House when Mel became a state rep, because prior to that, you always had to wear a jacket and tie on the floor, which to this day is the rule in the state Senate. Mel didn't do jackets and ties, so they changed the rules so Mel could be on the floor in his dashiki. And that's just a symbolic example of how he changed the Massachusetts House.
Only 8 years after the turmoil and violent protests of Boston's school desegregation plan erupted in certain parts of the city, Mel King surprised the political establishment by receiving enough votes to make the final runoff election for mayor of Boston against Ray Flynn.
But the 1983 mayor's race was truly historic. It was a real turning point both in black politics in this city and in progressive politics in the city. It was, in a way, campaigns usually aren't, a real break with the past. And a lot of that had to do with Mel's candidacy. You know, he was the first serious black mayoral candidate in the history of the city. He achieved, at a time of great racial unrest, something that very few people thought was possible in making the final. And it created a race, the race between Mel and Ray Flynn, that was not only unlikely, but genuinely unprecedented.
Here, sketch 1.
The Community Technology Center is a great example of Mel zeroing in on as what he sees as a political issue of this time, which is, you know, the great divide between people who are wired and people who aren't. And that this was an issue that's not political per se and below the radar, but it is economic, it's technological, and it's very important. And it's key to the futures young people in the South End are going to have. And it's very characteristic of him to take up the mantle, and I've been to the center, and they're doing really impressive things that nobody else is doing in the city.
Hi, I'm Sam Yoon. I'm a Boston City Councilor. I was elected at large, citywide, in 2005. I'm the first Asian American to be elected to office in the history of Boston. Mel King was a key inspiration for my running. And, you know, even early on, as I was kind of thinking about the possibility of running for office, he introduced me at my very first press conference in which I had officially announced my campaign for office. And as he introduced me, one of the key things that I remember him saying is that that my spirituality was something that would be an important part of my ability to lead in a political sense. So he's making that direct connection between spirituality and leadership, and that's really kind of it's amazing for him to be able to pick up on that, because it's something that we don't dwell on, or we haven't talked a lot about explicitly, but it's something that he felt, and I think that's a unique quality of Mel, to kind of to feel things and to sense things, and really using words, only when necessary. So that's what Mel King is to me, and he continues to provide that source of inspiration as someone, who is who's broken barriers in the city, but continues to have a vision for the community that's very deep and personal and spiritual, in that sense.
What I would say about Sam Yoon is that it is, in a way, a postscript to what Mel tried to do. He is, again, trying to build that same kind of coalition of progressives, of people of color, the same kind of thing that propelled Mel into the finals in '83. And we'll see how well, Sam Yoon's candidacy and now his time in office is a test of whether that kind of coalition can be built again and can endure in the city of Boston, and how far it can go. And it's going to be fascinating to watch. And Mel Shadow is very much behind, Sam Yoon's time in office.
I think the significant issues start with the Magna Carta.
The Magna Carta was issued in 1215 in England and was the first major step towards democracy and a social contract. It required a legal process for the accused and prohibited unlawful imprisonment by the state and king.
And the right to representation, it was, and I mean representation to bail, that as a person accused of something, they had some rights. And I think that's, for me, bedrock, even though I know that we have a president and people who would take us back to before the Magna Carta and have things done by feudalism, fiefdoms, emperors, etc. And I frankly like the Declaration of Independence as a statement. And there are other things, obviously, before. The right of revolution, the right to alter, the inalienable rights that are the gift of creation. Those kinds of statements and the way they lead to people's behavior in belief, I think are important as ways of beginning to think about how you build a human community where all the tribes are welcome. There was a very good article in the Globe this past Sunday where the issue of Christianity and the belief in war and the support for war is discussed. And it's the first time, at least, I'm not saying it hasn't happened before, but the first article that I've read which addresses the issue of how we are using violence in the name of religion. I mentioned earlier about beating the swords and the plowshares. We live in a time and place where we are beating the plowshares into swords. And there isn't a discussion about it. We have set it up so that we don't have any acts of forgiveness. What am I getting at? Well, there's this big thing about his being, nailed to the cross, to the tree, and he's saying, Father, forgive them. So we have a culture and a society that is very unforgiving.
2,819 people were killed on September 11, 2001. Unknown more were injured in body and mind. Can we forgive? Between 1 and 2 million people died as a result of the Vietnam War. Unknown more were injured in body and mind. More than 100,000 children have been born with birth defects after the war directly traced to Agent Orange. Can they forgive? Can we forgive ourselves?
Is democracy broken? Well, we've never, in my opinion, had real democracy anyhow. Because to me, democracy exists only where all the tribes, where all the people are welcome. And we don't have it in this country. I'm not sure where they have it. Voting is not democracy. Voting is a decision-making apparatus. It's generally about wins and losers. Democracy is where they're all winners. There are no contests for the share of the resources. It is where all the resources and understanding are on the basis of how we maximize our human potential and our human spirit. So is democracy broken? No. But I would like to use Vincent Harding's a way of talking about it, because he describes it as a work in progress. I see quite a few optimistic developments every day. There are people who do things in the interest of the health and welfare of other humans here. And I think we can go to many, many examples of where people do incredible acts of kindness and caring and sharing of resources. One is always asked, how would Boston be different if I was mayor? I think we would have a lot of different things around for youth. I think access to housing for folks whose incomes are limited would be greater. Maybe there'd be a few more tennis courts.
What I would say about Mel in terms of love and spirituality is that he is unique as a political figure in that he was never driven by personal ambition. He never seemed to be driven by the desire to hold this or that office. He was always driven by his love for his community, his love for his people, and I think that comes from a much deeper place than you would find in a typical candidate for any office. Mel ran for mayor, Mel ran for Congress, but it was always clear that that was never what he was about, that it was always coming from a deeper place and driven by much stronger forces. And I think that when he talks now about love and spirituality, that's what he's talking about. Those are the ideas that have always kind of animated him and the things that have driven him in whatever guise they may have taken.
I was over in Charlestown, and I was going to go through the housing development.
The white majority housing project that Mel visited that day in 1983 was a hotbed and focal point of racial tension.
I walked up and there were a lot of young people standing out, and they asked, I introduced myself. They knew I was running for mayor, and I said I came because I wanted to go knock on doors. And they thought I was absolutely crazy. And I said, well, why don't you just come with me? And then they knew I was crazy. So anyhow, there was a 10-year-old boy there. And he said, I'll go with you. because I want you to meet my family. So off we went. We knocked on doors and we got to his family. And it was incredible because his mother said, I don't know where he got it from, but he really likes you. And he's read about you and he knew about you. Now this is a 10-year-old boy, Caucasian, and fearless. It didn't bother him at all. He knew that I was a candidate for him, and we walked through there. So after we went through there, we headed back to the car where the signs and things were to wait for Phil, who had gone off to do something. And this man came up and he asked this boy what he was doing with this obviously black person. And he looked at him and he says, I don't know what you're talking about. He's my friend. That is a very, very, very significant aspect of the campaign. Because when you talk about the value in running, it's not necessarily in gaining the office, but it's gaining people's hearts and minds.
Mel King founded the South End Technology Center in the mid-1990s and continues his work there and in many other pursuits.
You know, we have the twin struggles, one for the land and one for the mind. Well, it's three, because I think the mind is tied in with the heart. You win the struggle for the mind and the heart, the land doesn't matter. It always comes.
Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight.
Preacher man, don't tell me heaven is under the earth. I know you don't know what life is really worth. Isn't all that glitter is gold? After story had never been told.
Well, my favorite quote is, love is the question and the answer.